What happens to a discovery that solves the problem it was born to fix? Picture a dim archive room where the air smells faintly of paper and dust. A box sits open on a metal table. Inside are lab notebooks with brittle pages, photographs curled at the edges, a few press clippings browned by time. The ink is steady, the data is tidy, the conclusions are oddly confident. You can almost hear the room where the experiments were done, the hum of equipment, the scrape of a stool, the quiet excitement of a result that refuses to be ignored. And then, somewhere after the breakthrough, the story goes quiet, not with an explosion, not with a scandal, often not even with an argument. It simply becomes harder to find, harder to fund, harder to teach, harder to publish. The footnotes thin out, the conferences move on. Students graduate into a new orthodoxy. The idea that once looked inevitable starts to feel like an odd detour, a rumor from a previous generation. This series is about those detours, not in the cheap sense of secrets, whispered behind locked doors, but in the truer human sense, the way progress is shaped by what people can afford to build, what institutions can approve, what businesses can sell, what systems can absorb without tearing. In a perfect world, good ideas rise on merit alone. In the real world, merit is only one traveler on the road. The others are timing, incentives, fear, habit, and the quiet power of what already exists. We like to tell the story of innovation as a straight line. Curiosity becomes research, research becomes a product, and the world gets better. But history keeps offering something messier. Sometimes an invention works. It works so well, in fact, that it threatens the routines built around the problem. It shortens a supply chain. It reduces maintenance. It turns scarcity into abundance. It makes a complicated industry feel suddenly unnecessary. And that can make the invention strangely fragile. Consider a treatment that depends on personalized matching instead of a one-size-fits-all pill, or a material that lasts longer than the contracts designed to replace it, or a method that's cheap enough to make an entire market shrink rather than grow. These aren't the kinds of obstacles that show up in a lab report. They live outside the microscope, in the world where decisions are made by committees, budgets, and forecasts. This is not a story of perfect heroes and perfect villains. The truth is almost always more ordinary and more unsettling than that. A regulator may demand evidence that no one is willing to pay for. A company may choose a scalable option over a superior one. A university may follow the gravity of funding. A government may prioritize strategic needs that have nothing to do with elegance or safety. A whole profession may protect its identity by protecting its tools. And quietly, the miracle becomes a niche. Over the next chapters, we'll walk through 10 innovations that demonstrated real promise in controlled tests or in early real-world use, and then slipped into the margins. A therapy that uses viruses to hunt bacteria with uncanny precision. A car body made from plant fiber that shrugged off a sledgehammer. A tree whose leaves can change the arithmetic of malnutrition. Concrete that can heal its own wounds. Soil restored with ground stone instead of chemical dependence. Electricity pulled from the temperature difference in the sea. A century-old approach to cancer that treated the immune system as a sleeping giant. Filters so thin and efficient, they make polluted water look like a solvable problem. A nuclear path that produces less waste and resists catastrophe by design. Transport tubes that imagined cities without traffic in a literal, physical sense. In each case, the core question is not, was it perfect, Few things are. The better question is, what happened after it worked? Because that's the moment we rarely examine. We celebrate the spark of invention, the courage of the first test, the photograph of a scientist smiling beside a prototype. But we pay less attention to the slow years after, when the world decides whether to make room. That decision is rarely about truth alone. It is about what a society is prepared to change about itself. And maybe that's the most revealing part. Not that progress is blocked by some single shadowy hand, but that progress can be blocked by 1,000 ordinary hands trying to keep their balance. So let's begin where these stories begin, with evidence that refuses to be fully erased, with a result that worked, with an idea that did not die in the lab but struggled in the world, and with a question that will follow us like a low, persistent note under the narration. If a solution is real, but the system can't afford for it to be true, what do we do with the truth? It begins in a hospital corridor that never truly sleeps. The lights are soft but relentless, the kind that make midnight feel like late afternoon. A nurse stands at a sink, scrubbing hands that have already been scrubbed a dozen times. Behind a door, with a small glass window, a patient breathes in short, cautious pulls. The chart at the foot of the bed is thick with notes, antibiotics listed like a timeline of hope. Started, adjusted, escalated, combined. Each time, the bacteria answered with the same cold message, still here. For most of the last century, we treated infection the way you treat a fire, smother it with chemicals designed to kill. Antibiotics were one of humanity's cleanest victories. A cut stopped being a death sentence. Surgery became safer. Childhood stopped being a roulette wheel. But fires learn, and bacteria, older than us by epochs, learn faster than we like to admit. There's a strange moment in modern medicine when the miracle turns around and looks at you. When an infection doesn't obey. When a lab report says resistant beside drug after drug, and the room feels a little smaller. In those moments, doctors turn to the newest options, to last resort drugs with heavy side effects and narrow windows of safety. Sometimes the body endures, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes a different kind of tool is waiting on the margins of the story, one that doesn't behave like a drug at all. Imagine something so small it is more concept than creature. A capsule of protein carrying a thread of genetic instruction. It drifts through the world the way a seed drifts on wind, but it is not gentle. It is a hunter. It recognizes one kind of bacterium the way a key recognizes a lock. It lands, it injects its code. And then, inside the bacterium, it multiplies until the host cell breaks open like a cracked shell, releasing a new swarm, each one tuned to the same prey. These are bacteriophages, phages for short, viruses that infect bacteria. They were discovered more than 100 years ago, back when microscopes still felt like portals. Early researchers used them experimentally, even therapeutically. Some places embraced the idea, others turned away, especially once antibiotics arrived. Easier to manufacture, easier to prescribe, easier to standardize. One pill could cover many infections, and the world ran with that convenience. Phages didn't fit the industrial rhythm. They are specific. A phage that kills one strain might ignore another. Effective use can require matching the right phage to the right bacterium, like choosing a tailored suit instead of buying one size in bulk. That specificity is their strength and their complication. Yet the logic is almost poetic. When bacteria evolve defenses, phages evolve responses. It's an arms race that's been running since before mammals existed. In theory, you can update phage cocktails the way you update software, responding to new resistance patterns with new viral hunters. Where antibiotics are a fixed chemical tool, phages are living pressure. In controlled settings and selected real-world cases, they've looked almost too elegant. Patients with chronic, drug-resistant infections have sometimes improved after fair treatment, when conventional options had failed. Not always, not universally, but often enough to make the question impossible to shrug off. So why aren't phages a standard part of care? Because medicine is not only science, it is infrastructure. To make phage therapy routine, you need reliable libraries of phages, rapid diagnostics to identify the infecting bacteria, manufacturing standards that can handle biological variability, and regulatory pathways built for something that behaves less like a chemical and more like a targeted, evolving organism. You need clinical trials that can be designed without turning specificity into a logistical nightmare. You need hospitals that can integrate the process without slowing everything else down. And you need an economic model that can reward a therapy whose greatest virtue may be that it prevents long, expensive disease. None of those barriers are malicious by default. They are simply the shape of the modern system, optimized for mass-produced uniformity. In the corridor, the nurse finishes scrubbing and dries her hands. The patient behind the door is still waiting for something that works. In a freezer somewhere, perhaps in a research institute, perhaps in a small clinic that specializes in the unusual, tiny hunters may already exist that could recognize the bacteria causing the harm. The knowledge is real. The mechanism is real. The promise, at least in some cases, has been real. Between that freezer and that bedside, however, lies a maze of approvals, budgets, scaling problems, and the old comfort of what doctors already know how to prescribe. The mystery isn't whether phages exist or whether they can work. The mystery is why, in a world running out of antibiotic time, the future still has to knock so softly to be heard. And if the most precise solutions require us to accept complexity again, personalization, adaptation, local matching, are we willing to rebuild the system to meet them? Or will we keep asking the system to choose what's easiest to repeat? In a workshop, a man lifts a hammer like he's about to settle an argument. The object on the table doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like a car panel, curved, dark, ordinary in the way industrial objects are ordinary. No chrome drama, no futuristic glow, just a piece of bodywork that belongs to something meant to move down a road. He swings. The blow lands with a hard, satisfying thud. The panel flexes, then holds. He swings again. The sound is the same, metallic in spirit, but not metal. The surface shows scuffs, not shatter. The demonstration is blunt, almost rude, as if the material demands to be tested in the language people actually trust. This is the strange power of simple proof. You don't have to explain it. You can feel it in your wrists. In the early 20th century, at a time when factories were becoming cathedrals of steel and smoke, there was an idea that didn't fit the prevailing logic. What if a car could be built, at least in part, from plants? It sounds like a modern sustainability pitch, the kind you'd expect from a startup with clean typography and carbon accounting. But the concept arrived decades before the world had a vocabulary for renewable materials. It arrived in an era when the automobile was still young enough to be reimagined, and when the boundary between farm and factory was not yet so fixed. The material at the heart of the story was a kind of composite, fibers bound together into something strong, light, and surprisingly resilient. Instead of relying entirely on steel, it used agricultural inputs. People argued over the exact recipes, the precise fibers, the binders, the proportions, because innovation is often a fog of prototypes before it becomes a product. But the core claim was consistent. This plant-based bodywork could take a beating. And beyond toughness, it promised something else, a different relationship between industry and land. A car whose materials could, in part, be grown. A supply chain that included fields as well as foundries. A future where rural economies and manufacturing might share a single heartbeat. It was a romantic vision, but not purely romantic. Weight matters. Lighter vehicles use less fuel. Materials that don't rust behave differently over time. Manufacturing that can shape composites could reduce certain costs, change certain constraints. Even the idea of decentralizing inputs, of not relying so heavily on mined and processed metal, carried strategic appeal. So why didn't it become the obvious path? Part of the answer is that history doesn't like forks in the road. Once a system commits, it hardens. Steel had momentum. Factories, tools, skilled labor, standards, repair ecosystems, recycling channels. The entire automotive world learned to speak in the language of metal, pressing, welding, stamping, forming. And when you can build millions of vehicles with a proven process, the burden of proof shifts. A new material has to be not only good, it has to be compatible with the whole civilization that already formed around the old one. Then there's timing. Materials live and die by what the world is worrying about. In moments of war, industries prioritize scale, predictability, and supply chains that can be controlled under strain. In moments of economic fear, industries prioritize what investors understand. In moments of technological transition, industries cling to the methods they can certify and ensure. A composite that behaves beautifully in a demonstration still has to survive regulatory frameworks, crash standards, manufacturing variability, and decades of performance expectations. And a plant-based material introduces its own questions: consistency of feedstock, vulnerability to weather and agriculture cycles, the politics of land use, the risks of relying on crops that might be needed for food. Even the chemistry of binders can complicate the natural story. Innovations that sound pure often require compromise when they meet real-world mass production. But the most quiet and persistent obstacle is this: success can threaten the old bargains. If a car lasts longer, replacement cycles change. If body panels resist corrosion, repair markets evolve. If sourcing shifts from heavy industry to agriculture, existing stakeholders lose leverage. None of this requires a conspiracy. It requires only normal human behavior, people protecting what they know, what they own, what they can predict. Still, the demonstration remains stubbornly persuasive. A hammer, a panel, a refusal to break. When we talk about progress, we usually mean faster, smarter, more complex. But sometimes, progress is simply a different material, a different starting point, something that changes the story of where objects come from and where they return when they're done. A plant-based car body is not just a technical idea, it's a question posed to an entire economy. What if we built durability and renewal into the bones of our machines? The panel on the table doesn't answer. It just endures. And the question lingers in the air, like dust in a shaft of light. If we already knew how to make things that lasted, why did we keep choosing things we had to replace? In a small village, a mother watches a pot of porridge thicken over a low flame. The steam rises slowly, carrying the scent of grain. It is a smell that means something here. Food, yes, but also survival. A child sits nearby, eyes heavy, body too quiet for the age it's meant to be. In places like this, hunger is rarely dramatic. It doesn't always announce itself with an empty plate. Sometimes it hides in the body as fatigue, as slow growth, as a kind of dimness in the blood. Malnutrition can be a thief that doesn't break windows. It just keeps taking. Among its most common tools is a shortage of micronutrients, iron, vitamin A, zinc, small elements with enormous influence. Iron, in particular, is the difference between strength and exhaustion, between a mind that can focus and one that drifts. When iron deficiency becomes widespread, it reshapes entire communities, school performance, maternal health, workplace capacity, long-term development. For decades, the world has tried to answer this with fortification and supplements. Add iron to flour, distribute tablets, enrich foods in factories. These strategies work, especially where infrastructure is stable, but they depend on supply chains, on compliance, on budgets that don't collapse with political wins. And in many regions, the roads are long, the systems are fragile, the need is relentless. What if the solution could grow in the field instead of arriving in a bottle? Picture a seed. It doesn't look like medicine. It looks like a promise you can hold between your fingers. Plant it, and months later, it becomes a harvest. Grain that feeds, grain that stores, grain that travels less than a pill does. This is the heart of biofortification. Breeding crops to contain higher levels of essential nutrients, not by changing the way people eat, but by improving what they already rely on. It's a strategy built on humility. It assumes that culture is not easily rewritten, and that the most respectful intervention is one that meets people where they already are. One of the most striking examples is a variety of rice engineered to produce beta-carotene, a precursor to vitamin A, a nutrient whose absence can lead to blindness and increased vulnerability to disease. Another is iron-rich crops developed through breeding programs. Beans, millet, sweet potatoes, and yes, rice varieties aimed at improving iron intake where anemia is common. In early studies and pilot efforts, these crops showed real potential. Nutrient levels increased, health markers improved, the logic was clean. If a staple becomes more nourishing, the benefit repeats itself every day, every meal, without requiring constant distribution campaigns. So why does the story still feel unfinished? Because food is never just food. Crops are entwined with identity, politics, trade, and trust. A seed is not merely biology, it is ownership, it is sovereignty, it is the memory of what came before and fear of what might come after. Biofortified crops, especially those involving genetic engineering, stepped into a world already anxious about control. Who decides what is planted? Who holds the patents? Who profits? What happens to farmers if seed systems change? Can a local community trust a product whose science arrives from elsewhere? And even when the science is sound, can the communication be? Then there are practical realities. A crop that thrives in one region may struggle in another. Nutrient expression can vary with soil and climate. Distribution of improved seeds requires its own infrastructure. And when global attention drifts, programs can lose momentum. But the deepest tension may be this: solutions that are too elegant can become ideological battlegrounds. Some critics worry about unintended consequences, about genetic drift, about corporate influence. about the risk of turning complex nutritional issues into a single crop fix. Some advocates argue that refusing biofortification in the face of preventable deficiency is its own kind of ethical failure. Between these poles, real people live: farmers, parents, children who need food today and trust tomorrow. There's also an uncomfortable economic truth. Malnutrition is devastating, but it is not a profitable market in the same way as chronic disease in wealthy countries. The incentives for massive, sustained investment don't always align with the moral urgency. The world funds crises. It struggles to fund quiet suffering that never makes headlines. Back in the village, the porridge is ready. It will fill bellies. It will not necessarily fill blood with iron or eyes with vitamin A. That's the tragedy of calories without micronutrients. A child can eat and still be missing what makes eating truly nourishing. Biofortification asks a deceptively simple question: can we design abundance so that it actually nourishes? And it leaves us with a harder one. If we can grow health into the very staples that sustain life, what does it say about us when we hesitate? Not because the need is unclear, but because trust is. On a cold morning, a bridge carries the weight of a city like a held breath. From a distance, it looks immortal: stone and steel, geometry and confidence. Cars roll across it in steady lines. Beneath, water moves with the patience of gravity. But up close, the bridge tells another story. Hairline cracks thread through concrete like fine veins. Some are harmless, a natural response to stress and time. Others are invitations, tiny doorways for water, salt, and freeze-thaw cycles to enter and begin their slow work. Concrete is everywhere. It is the most human of stones, poured into shape, hardened into permanence. And yet, it is also fragile in a way we rarely notice until it fails. Not because it is weak at the start, but because the world keeps pressing on it. Traffic, weather, vibration, expansion, contraction, the constant persuasion of time. Maintenance is the unglamorous cost of civilization. Bridges are inspected, roads are patched, buildings are reinforced. Entire industries exist to chase cracks before they become fractures, to keep the illusion of permanence alive. Now, imagine concrete that does something we associate with living tissue. Imagine a crack forming, and then, slowly, the crack filling itself. The concept sounds like science fiction until you see it described in the blunt language of materials science. Certain formulations of self-healing concrete embed agents that respond when cracks appear. Some rely on microcapsules of healing compounds that rupture under stress, releasing materials that harden and seal the gap. Others use mineral-based additives that react with water to form new crystalline structures. And one of the most haunting approaches uses biology: dormant bacteria mixed into the concrete, sealed in place like tiny time capsules. When water enters a crack, those bacteria awaken. They feed on nutrients included in the mix, and in the process, they produce limestone-like minerals that precipitate into the crack, stitching it closed. It's an idea that makes you pause, not because it's magical, but because it's familiar. Nature has been repairing itself for billions of years. Why wouldn't we borrow that trick for the bones of our cities? In demonstrations and early applications, self-healing concrete has shown the kind of promise that feels almost unfair. Cracks that would normally widen or invite corrosion can become sealed. Water permeability can drop dramatically. Steel reinforcement, so vulnerable to corrosion once water and salt get in, can be protected before damage becomes irreversible. The implications are enormous. Longer-lasting bridges, fewer emergency repairs, reduced life cycle costs, less disruption, less material consumption, less carbon from replacement and reconstruction. So why isn't every new structure made this way? Because better is not the same as adopted. The first obstacle is cost, at least upfront. Self-healing formulations often cost more per unit than conventional concrete, and procurement systems tend to reward the lowest initial bid, not the lowest lifetime cost. The future savings belong to the public, to the owner, to the next administration, to the next budget cycle. The present expense belongs to the person signing today's contract. Then there's the question of standards. Construction is one of the most conservative industries for a reason. People live and die under what we build. New materials must be tested, certified and trusted across decades, climates, and failure modes. A lab result is persuasive. A bridge that stands for 50 years is proof. Until that proof arrives, the default is to use what has already earned its scars. There's also the complexity of scaling. Concrete is not one product. It's a family of mixtures tuned to local aggregates, local climates, local practices. What works in one region may behave differently in another. The supply chain for additives, the training of crews, the inspection protocols, these all require change, and change is expensive in ways spreadsheets don't always capture. But beneath the technical obstacles lies a quiet attention. Self-healing materials reduce the need for certain kinds of work. Maintenance is a market. Repair is a market. Replacement is a market. When something lasts longer, it can threaten the economic rhythm of industries built around fixing what breaks. Again, this doesn't require malice. It requires inertia. Entire ecosystems form around predictable decay. And yet, decay is not destiny. It's a choice we've normalized. If you've ever watched a road crew patch the same stretch of pavement year after year, you've seen the ritual. We repair the wound, not the condition that causes it. We accept that cracks are the price of building. We budget for failure as if it were weather. Self-healing concrete challenges that bargain. It suggests a future where structures are not static objects but responsive systems, materials that anticipate the world instead of merely enduring it. Back on the bridge, a crack is forming somewhere you can't see, under a seam, along a stress line, inside the grey. In ordinary concrete, that crack is a beginning of leakage, corrosion, expansion, and eventually costly repair. In self-healing concrete, the crack is a signal, a trigger, the start of a response. The bridge doesn't become immortal. Nothing does, but it becomes more like a living thing, able to resist small injuries before they become fatal. And that leaves a question that feels less like engineering and more like philosophy. If we can build a world that quietly repairs itself, why do we keep accepting a world that breaks loudly and calls that normal? At the edge of a farm, the soil looks tired. Not dead, not barren, just exhausted in the way a face can be exhausted. Still functional, still present, but missing the deeper vitality that once made it luminous. The top layer is thinner than it should be. The wind lifts dust more easily. Rain arrives like a blunt instrument, washing nutrients downhill instead of sinking in and staying. For a long time, modern agriculture answered exhaustion the way modern industry answers most things, with inputs: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, a precise recipe of chemicals to replace what harvests remove. The system worked, at least in the narrow sense that yields rose and hunger in many regions fell. But the land kept a ledger. Fertilizer can feed plants, but it can also bypass the complex living economy of soil. The fungi, the microbes, the organic matter that hold water, cycle nutrients, and keep a field resilient through heat and drought. And when excess fertilizer runs off into rivers and seas, it feeds another kind of growth. Algae blooms that suffocate waters, dead zones where oxygen vanishes and life flees. So the question becomes less about feeding plants and more about restoring the ground itself. There is an approach to this that sounds almost too simple to be modern. Crush rocks, spread the dust, and let chemistry do the quiet work. It's sometimes called enhanced rock weathering. The concept is ancient, because weathering is how the planet has regulated itself for eons. Rain falls, CO2 dissolves into water, water meets rock, minerals break down. Over time, carbon is locked into stable forms, soils are enriched, oceans are buffered. It is one of Earth's slow, steady balancing acts. The innovation is not discovering weathering, it's accelerating it. Certain rocks, basalt is often mentioned, contain minerals that, when ground into fine particles, react more quickly with CO2 and water. Spread that powder across farmland, and you potentially get several benefits at once. The soil can receive minerals that improve fertility. The chemistry can help neutralize acidity. The physical presence of fine mineral dust can influence water retention. And as the minerals react, they can draw down carbon from the air, storing it in forms that are less eager to return. In early trials and pilot programs, the results have been promising enough to stir the imagination. Farmers see improved yields in some contexts. Scientists measure changes in soil chemistry. Climate researchers see a pathway, one of many, that could help slow the accumulation of greenhouse gases if scaled responsibly. This is not a silver bullet. It is, at best, a tool in a crowded toolbox. But it is a tool with an unusual beauty. It makes use of processes the planet already knows how to run. So why isn't rock dust already a global agricultural standard? Because scaling nature is harder than admiring it. To deploy enhanced weathering widely, you need mining, grinding, and transport. An industrial operation that itself consumes energy and creates emissions. If the energy isn't clean, the climate benefit shrinks. You need careful matching of rock type to soil and crop. You need monitoring to ensure you aren't introducing harmful trace elements. You need models that can predict where the method works and where it doesn't. And you need farmers to take on a practice that may not yield immediate, guaranteed returns. Then there is the politics of responsibility. Rock dust sits in an awkward space between agriculture and climate policy. Is it a farm input? A carbon removal technology? Both? If it becomes tied to carbon credits, who verifies it? Who profits? Who bears the risk if the promised carbon drawdown is overestimated? And there is the human hurdle of attention. Fertilizer is an established story. It has marketing. It has infrastructure. It has a century of habit behind it. Rock dust is quieter. It is not a product with a sleek label and instant impact. It is patience in powdered form. At the edge of the farm, you can imagine two futures. In one, the land is treated like a factory floor. Yield is extracted, and exhaustion is patched over with more and more inputs. The soil holds on until it can't. And then it becomes another crisis to solve with money and urgency. In the other, the land is treated like a living system. The goal is not just production, but resilience. The soil becomes deeper, darker, richer. Water stays longer. Drought hurts less. Carbon is quietly pulled down and stored in the chemistry of the earth. Neither future is guaranteed. Both require choices, not just technologies. And that may be the real heart of this chapter. Rock weathering asks us to invest in slow improvement, in benefits that compound over time, in a relationship with the ground that is less extractive and more reciprocal. We are good at building machines that move fast. We are less practiced at building systems that heal slowly. So the question is, not only whether crushed rock can restore soil and draw down carbon, the question is whether we are willing to measure success in decades again, and to treat the earth beneath our feet not as a resource to spend, but as a partner we can rebuild. Far offshore, the ocean keeps a secret in plain sight. Stand on the deck of a ship at dawn and watch the surface change color as the sun rises. The water holds heat like a memory. Even after a cool night, it remains warmer than the air. And deeper down, where sunlight fades and pressure grows, the water is cold, steadily, stubbornly cold, as if it belongs to another season entirely. That difference, warm on top, cold below, is a kind of invisible slope, a gradient, a stored potential. The sea is full of them. For decades, engineers have looked at that temperature gap and felt a familiar itch. If energy is the ability to do work, then surely the ocean is working all the time. The question is whether we can borrow a little of that work without breaking the machine. This is where an idea returns again and again, like a lighthouse blinking through fog. Generate electricity by exploiting the temperature difference between warm surface water and cold deep water. The concept is called Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion, OTEC. It sounds like a neat acronym, but the physics is almost old-fashioned. A heat engine is any system that takes heat from a warm source, sends some of that energy through a cycle, and rejects the leftover heat into a colder sink. Steam engines did it with fire and air. OTEC proposes to do it with sunlight-warmed sea water and the ocean's natural cold depths. In one approach, warm seawater heats a working fluid with a low boiling point, something that evaporates easily. That vapor spins a turbine. Cold, deep water condenses it back into liquid, ready to repeat the cycle. In another approach, warm seawater itself is flashed into steam under low pressure, driving a turbine, then condensed by cold water. The technology is conceptually straightforward. The challenge is that the temperature difference, though vast in geographic scale, is modest in degrees, often around 22 degrees or so in the best tropical regions. And small temperature differences mean low efficiency. To produce meaningful power, you have to move enormous volumes of water. Enormous. Pipes must reach down hundreds, sometimes 1,000 meters, into cold depths. Pumps must run continuously. Corrosion, biofouling, storms, and salt become constant adversaries. The ocean is generous with energy, but it is also demanding. It requires engineering with humility. Still, the idea has been demonstrated. Pilot plants have generated power. Designs have matured. The promise is not only electricity, but a suite of co-benefits that feel almost like a utopian brochure, except that they emerge naturally from the process. The cold, deep water can be used for air conditioning, replacing energy-hungry chillers with seawater cooling. It can support aquaculture because nutrient-rich deep water can feed marine life near the surface. It can help produce fresh water through desalination or condensation processes. In island regions, where fuel is imported at high cost, OTEC hints at energy independence that is both clean and locally anchored. So why does it still feel like a technology forever on the edge of almost? Because the ocean is a place where costs become heavy. Building offshore infrastructure is expensive. Maintaining it is expensive. Financing it demands confidence, not just in physics, but in politics and contracts, in the stability of energy markets over decades. Traditional power plants can be built on land with roads and cranes and predictable weather windows. OTEC must be built in a realm where every bolt lives in salt, where storms arrive with teeth, where repairs require ships and specialized crews. Then there's the problem of comparison. OTEC's advantages are strongest in specific places: tropical waters, islands, coastal regions with deep cold water nearby. But energy policy is often written as if one solution must dominate everywhere. A technology that is regionally perfect can be dismissed because it isn't universally convenient. And in an era where solar and wind have surged in scale and dropped dramatically in price, OTEC faces a new kind of competition. Not from fossil fuels alone, but from other renewables that are easier to deploy quickly. The world's urgency to decarbonize favors technologies that can spread fast. OTEC is more like a cathedral than a tent, beautiful, enduring, but slow to build. Yet the ocean keeps offering its gradient, day after day, year after year. It is the planet's largest solar collector, absorbing heat and redistributing it like a bloodstream. We have learned to harvest sunlight from rooftops and wind from ridges. The sea remains, mostly, a sleeping giant of continuous thermal motion. There is also an emotional aspect to OTEC that rarely enters technical discussions. It feels like a reconciliation with nature's scale. Instead of punching holes in the ground, you borrow a temperature difference that will exist tomorrow regardless. Instead of burning ancient carbon, you let the sun warm the sea and take a fraction of the resulting flow. But every reconciliation requires trust. Trust in engineering, in governance, in long-term stewardship. The ocean is not a backdrop. It is a living system. And any industrial intervention must be careful with heat plumes, nutrient cycles, and local ecosystems. So the question becomes layered. Not only can we build machines that drink from the ocean's temperature gradient, but also, can we build them in a way that honors the ocean's complexity, and can we commit to infrastructure that pays back slowly, steadily, over decades? Somewhere out there, above cold depths, warm water continues to drift under the sun. The gradient remains, the potential remains, the idea remains, and the listener is left with a quiet thought that sounds almost like a challenge. If one of the largest power sources on Earth is literally under our feet when we stand at a shoreline, what does it mean that we still treat it as a curiosity instead of a cornerstone? In a lecture hall, a doctor draws a circle on the board and pauses. Inside the circle, she writes a single word: self. Then, around it, she sketches arrows: threat, response, memory, restraint. The room is quiet, in the particular way it gets when people are asked to rethink something fundamental. Because medicine, for all its complexity, often comes down to a few recurring puzzles. And one of the deepest is this: why does the immune system, capable of recognizing and destroying microscopic invaders, so often fail to recognize a tumor growing in plain sight? Cancer is sometimes described as an enemy, but biologically, it is more like a betrayal. Cells that belong to the body, using the body's own rules to multiply and survive. They learn to hide. They learn to mute alarms. They learn to turn the immune system's caution against it, because the immune system is built not only to attack, but to avoid attacking the self. For most of modern oncology's history, treatments focused on direct assault: cut it out, burn it, poison it. Surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, methods that can be life-saving and are often necessary, but that also carry collateral damage. Over time, a second vision emerged. Instead of fighting cancer alone, what if we could wake up the immune system and let it do what it was designed to do? Today, immunotherapy is a major pillar of cancer treatment, but its roots stretch back further than most people realize, into a story that feels almost like a forgotten prologue. In the late 19th century, a surgeon noticed something strange. Some cancer patients who developed severe bacterial infections seemed to experience tumor regression. It wasn't reliable, and it wasn't safe by modern standards, but it was hard to ignore. The body, in the throes of a powerful immune response, sometimes turned its fury not only toward the infection, but toward the tumor as well. From this observation came an audacious idea. If infection could sometimes trigger tumor shrinkage, could we mimic the immune stimulation without letting patients die of the infection itself? The approach involved injecting mixtures of bacterial toxins to provoke an immune response. Early reports described dramatic remissions in certain cases. Other reports were inconsistent. Some patients improved, others didn't. Records were not always standardized. Medicine was still developing the tools for controlled trials, and oncology had not yet become the data-driven discipline we know now. But the core idea was there. Use immune activation as a weapon. Over time, the method fell out of favor, partly because it was unpredictable, partly because new treatments emerged that seemed more controllable, radiation, and later, chemotherapy. Partly because mainstream medicine was becoming increasingly skeptical of therapies that didn't fit standardized protocols. And partly because medicine has a short tolerance for ambiguity, especially when the stakes are life and death. Yet the story didn't disappear entirely. It lingered in the margins, in the historical footnotes of oncology, in the stubborn intuition that the immune system mattered more than we understood. Decades later, science began to catch up with the old observation. Researchers learned about cytokines, about immune checkpoints, about the subtle signaling pathways that decide when immune cells attack and when they stand down. The immune system, it turned out, was not a single weapon, but an orchestra, and cancer had learned how to quiet the loudest instruments. Modern checkpoint inhibitors, drugs that block the brakes tumors use to suppress immune cells, are in a way a refined answer to that old idea. So are CAR-T cells, engineered immune cells designed to recognize specific cancers. So are cancer vaccines, oncolytic viruses, and other strategies that treat the immune system not as an afterthought, but as the main stage. And that raises a haunting possibility. What if some of the most important medical revolutions are not brand new, but rediscovered? Not that earlier methods were perfect, they weren't. Many were risky, and some would be unacceptable today. But within them was a question that the century wasn't ready to answer. The tools weren't ready. The language wasn't ready. The evidence standards weren't ready. The infrastructure wasn't ready. So the idea slept. What makes this story feel relevant now is not nostalgia. It's humility. It reminds us that innovation is not always a straight march forward. Sometimes it is a spiral. We circle back to old observations with new instruments, new frameworks, and new caution. We turn a wild hunch into a measurable mechanism. We take something that looked like superstition and reveal it as biology we hadn't yet learned to see. In the lecture hall, the doctor adds another word to the circle: recognition. Because that's what immune-based cancer therapy ultimately requires: the body recognizing what it has been taught to ignore. And that recognition isn't only biological, it's cultural, it's institutional. It's the willingness to revisit forgotten corners of medical history and ask, without embarrassment, whether we walked away too soon. The question at the end of this chapter is not whether old immune stimulation approaches should return unchanged. They shouldn't. The question is deeper. How many observations have we dismissed as noise because we didn't yet have the science to translate them into signal? And when a treatment fails to fit the clean lines of our current paradigm, do we have the patience to keep listening until the future gives us better ears? A glass of water sits on a table, catching the afternoon light. It looks innocent. It always does. That's one of water's cruelties. It can carry danger without changing its face. No smoke, no smell, no warning flare, just clarity or the illusion of it. In some places, water is a casual assumption. You twist a faucet and life continues. In others, water is a daily calculation. Which source is least risky? How far is the pump? How much fuel will it take to boil? How many stomach illnesses will follow if you choose wrong? The stakes are quiet and constant. Diarrheal disease doesn't usually arrive with cinematic drama, but it has shaped childhood survival and community health for as long as humans have gathered around rivers. It steals time, strength, school days, wages. In extreme cases, it steals lives. We have technologies to purify water, chlorination, filtration, UV treatment, reverse osmosis. But each comes with its own burdens: cost, maintenance, energy demand, chemical supply chains, waste brine, replacement parts. The world is full of clever purification methods that struggle in the places most in need of simplicity. Now, imagine a filter so thin it feels like a whisper. A sheet with pores small enough to block salt, bacteria, and many contaminants, yet engineered to let water flow through with less resistance, less pressure needed, less energy consumed, less machinery required. This is the promise that emerged with a new class of materials, ultra-thin membranes, including those inspired by the structure of graphene and related nanomaterials. In lab settings, researchers demonstrated membranes with extraordinary selectivity and permeability. The dream was immediate: desalination without such crushing energy costs, portable purification for disaster zones, affordable treatment for communities far from centralized infrastructure. In the early years, the results read like a future trying to break into the present: water flowing fast, salt rejected, the math of efficiency rewritten. So why aren't these membranes everywhere? Because what works under controlled conditions must survive the world. A membrane is not just a surface, it is a system. It must endure fouling, organic matter, biofilms, minerals that accumulate and clog pores. It must resist tearing, cracking, chemical degradation. It must be manufactured consistently at scale, not just as a beautiful sample in a laboratory. It must be packaged into modules that can be installed, cleaned, replaced, and trusted. Nanoscale engineering can produce astonishing performance, but it often struggles with the brutal economics of mass production. Making something perfect at small scale is one challenge. Making it reliably, cheaply, and safely by the square kilometer is another. Then there is the question of safety and perception. When you introduce nanomaterials into water systems, people ask an honest question. What happens if particles shed? What are the long-term health effects? Even if risk is low, trust must be earned. And in public utilities, the cost of getting it wrong is enormous. There's also a less visible barrier. The water industry moves slowly by necessity. Municipal systems are designed to run for decades. New technologies must prove themselves in long-term pilots, under variable conditions, with regulators watching. Failure is not just a business loss, it's a public health event. And yet, the need is urgent. Climate change shifts rainfall patterns. Populations grow. Aquifers are depleted. Saltwater intrusion creeps into coastal freshwater. Drought becomes a recurring chapter, not a rare interruption. Clean water is no longer a stable inheritance. It is becoming a frontier again. The strangest part is that on paper, the innovation is straightforward. The world already filters water. It already desalinates seawater. A better membrane should be an obvious upgrade. But upgrades threaten balance. If water becomes cheaper to produce, it can change geopolitical leverage in water-scarce regions. If purification becomes decentralized, it can disrupt utility business models. If desalination expands, it raises questions about energy sources and environmental impacts of brine discharge. Even a good solution generates new responsibilities. In a sense, the membrane isn't only filtering salt and microbes, it's filtering the future through the narrow pores of our readiness to change. Back at the table, the glass of water still catches light. It still looks like nothing to fear. But somewhere far away, a child drinks from a source that will make them sick. Somewhere else, a city debates building a desalination plant that will cost billions. Somewhere else, a storm knocks out infrastructure and people line up for bottled water, each bottle a small, plastic monument to a system that failed temporarily but predictably. The membrane is waiting in the lab-to-market corridor, where many good ideas stall. The gap between it works and it works everywhere, reliably, safely, affordably. And the question that lingers is both technical and moral. If we can make clean water simpler, why do we keep accepting a world where access to it is treated as a privilege of geography and money? Or, to put it more quietly, how many lives are shaped by the distance between a breakthrough and a pipeline? In the control room of a nuclear plant, the quiet is deliberate. Screens glow in measured colors. Alarms are not screaming. They are waiting, like a language that only speaks when something is wrong. Operators sit with a posture that suggests responsibility more than power. Outside, behind layers of concrete and steel, something ancient is being persuaded to release its heat. Nuclear energy has always carried two stories at once. One is the promise, dense, reliable power without the smoke of fossil fuels. The other is the fear, accidents, waste, the lingering shadow of weapons. For decades, the world has argued about which story deserves the microphone. But inside the engineering community, another story has been told in a lower voice. A story about a different nuclear path, one that tries to change the rules of the risk itself. Picture a reactor that doesn't behave like the ones most people imagine. Instead of solid fuel rods, imagine fuel dissolved in a liquid. Instead of water under extreme pressure, imagine salts that remain stable at high temperatures. Instead of a system that must be actively cooled to prevent catastrophe, imagine one designed so that when something goes wrong, the safest state is the one it naturally falls into. These designs have existed on paper and in prototypes for a long time. Among the most discussed are molten salt reactors, including those that use thorium as a fuel source in certain configurations. The details can become technical quickly, but the emotional heart is simple. What if nuclear could be built to fail gently? In some molten salt designs, if the system overheats, a freeze plug of solidified salt melts, and the fuel drains into a passively cooled tank where the chain reaction stops. No heroic intervention required, no frantic race against a clock, just gravity and physics restoring order. Thorium, meanwhile, has appealed to many because it is relatively abundant and in certain fuel cycles can produce less long-lived transuranic waste than conventional uranium fuel cycles. It is not a magic escape hatch. Waste still exists, and the fuel cycle is complex, but it shifts the conversation from how do we manage catastrophe to how do we design risk out of the architecture? And then there's proliferation. Some advocates argue that certain thorium-based approaches could reduce the attractiveness of diverted materials for weapons, though the reality is nuanced and depends heavily on the exact design, the fuel processing methods, and governance. Even the best engineering cannot replace politics and safeguards. It can only change the terrain. So why does this story, so elegant in concept, feel perpetually stuck in the future? Because nuclear is not just an energy technology, it is an institutional technology. It requires licensing frameworks, public trust, vast capital, long timelines, and a tolerance for complexity that few sectors demand. Regulators must understand the design deeply enough to approve it. Investors must accept projects measured in decades. Communities must believe that safety isn't merely claimed, but proven. And governments must commit to consistency across election cycles. That is a tall order, even for familiar designs. For the novel designs, it becomes mountainous. There's also a historical inertia. The world built its nuclear infrastructure, supply chains, expertise, standards around certain reactor types. Entire professions learned a specific dialect of nuclear engineering. Switching to a new dialect means retraining, rewriting codes, retooling factories, and building a new safety case from the ground up. And then there's the economics of the present. Cheap natural gas in some regions, rapidly declining costs for solar and wind, and improving battery storage have reshaped the energy landscape. Nuclear, already burdened by high upfront costs and public skepticism, must compete in a market that rewards speed and modularity. A technology designed for a long, steady future is trying to survive in an impatient now. Still, the problem nuclear once promised to solve has not disappeared. The climate is warming. Electrification is accelerating. Grid stability matters. Industrial heat demands are enormous, and the planet's appetite for energy is not shrinking. In that context, the idea of safer, more flexible nuclear, reactors that can be smaller, that can load follow, that can pair with renewables, returns like a recurring dream. Not as an ideology, but as a pragmatic question. What are we willing to build to keep the lights on, without burning the sky? In the control room, the screens continue their soft glow. Somewhere in a lab or a pilot facility, engineers are still working on reactors that treat safety as a default state, not an emergency procedure. The physics is not impossible. The promise is not imaginary. The obstacle is the space between invention and adoption, the long corridor of trust, regulation, funding, and collective courage. And that leaves us with a final, uncomfortable reflection. If we demand perfection before we allow a tool to help us, do we end up choosing the familiar harms we already know? Or can we learn to build systems, especially the dangerous ones, that are humble enough to fail safely and brave enough to be tried? In a city choked by traffic, the air feels like a slow apology. Engines idle at red lights. Buses crawl forward in exhausted bursts. Horns speak a language of impatience that never really says anything new. Above it all, the buildings stand like witnesses to a daily ritual. Millions of people spending pieces of their lives in motion that barely counts as movement. We accept congestion the way we accept weather. We complain about it, but we plan around it. We price it into our hours. We build wider roads and somehow fill them. We tell ourselves that the gridlock is the cost of modern life. But what if it isn't? What if the shape of the city could change, not by building more lanes, but by changing the medium of travel itself? Imagine a tube, smooth and sealed, stretching across a landscape like a line drawn by a confident hand. Inside, a capsule glides, not on wheels, but on a cushion of air or magnetic force. The pressure inside the tube is reduced, so there's less air resistance. The capsule moves fast, faster than cars, faster than trains in some visions, without the constant friction that steals energy and speed. This idea has worn many names over the decades: pneumatic transit, vacuum tube transport, evacuated tube trains. In recent years, one version has dominated headlines: Hyperloop. It's easy to dismiss it as futuristic branding, sleek renderings, gravity-defying promises. But behind the marketing is a real engineering intuition. If you reduce drag and friction, you can move objects efficiently at high speeds. The physics is not nonsense. The challenge is making it real at scale, in the messy world of land rights, safety requirements, budgets, and human bodies. Prototypes have been built, test tracks have been run, demonstrations have shown pods accelerating within tubes. Engineers have refined concepts for levitation, propulsion, and control. The promise has been framed as a new backbone for regional travel, something that could connect cities in minutes rather than hours. So why does it still feel like an idea searching for a home? Because transportation is not a single problem. It is a web of problems. First, there is safety. If a capsule is moving at airline-like speeds inside a tube, what happens when something goes wrong? How do you evacuate passengers from a sealed environment? How do you handle earthquakes, thermal expansion, power loss, fire, structural breaches? Aviation has decades of protocols and redundancies. Rail has its own. A tube system would require an entire new safety culture, proven through tests so exhaustive they become expensive by default. Second, there is cost. Tubes require land, supports, materials, vacuum systems, maintenance access, and precision engineering over long distances. Every mile is a negotiation with geography and property owners. Every curve and gradient is a design constraint. Building new right-of-way infrastructure is often the most expensive part of any transport project, regardless of the technology inside it. Third, there is competition from existing systems. High-speed rail, where it exists, already offers fast regional travel with well-understood engineering and regulatory frameworks. Upgrading conventional rail, expanding bus networks, improving metro systems, these are less glamorous, but often more immediately effective for the daily lives of most people. And then there is the fundamental question of purpose. Hyperloop-like systems are best at long, straight runs between major nodes. But cities are not only nodes, they are networks of neighborhoods. The hardest part of commuting is often not the intercity leg, it's the last miles, from station to home, from home to work. A technology that solves the middle while ignoring the ends can feel impressive without being transformative. Still, the idea continues to pull attention because it speaks to something deeper than speed. It speaks to the hunger for a world where movement is not misery, where distance shrinks without extraction, where a region feels more connected, not by widening highways, but by making travel quieter, cleaner, and less time-consuming. And there is a subtle emotional appeal in tubes. Containment, a controlled environment, a promise that weather won't delay you, that traffic won't trap you, that the chaos of the open road can be replaced with the calm of engineered flow. But containment comes with its own trade. The more controlled a system is, the more it depends on the integrity of its control. A crack, a power outage, a sabotage event. Suddenly, the tube is not a shelter, but a vulnerability. The future demands not only speed, but resilience. In the city, cars continue to inch forward. People stare at phones, at dashboards, at the back of the next vehicle, as if the next few feet might contain a miracle. They breathe air that carries the residue of motion. Meanwhile, the tube remains an idea that could, in theory, change the narrative, if the narrative is ready to change. Perhaps the most honest question is not, will Hyperloop happen, but what kind of world would make it worth building? A world that values long-term infrastructure over short-term convenience. A world that can coordinate across regions. A world willing to spend now to save time, energy, and emissions later. And finally, a world willing to admit that traffic is not inevitable. It is a design choice we keep renewing. So as the horns keep speaking, the chapter ends with a quiet, persistent thought. If we can imagine travel that feels like gliding through silence, why do we keep accepting a life measured in brake lights? And what other futures are waiting? Not for better technology, but for better courage to build. In a warehouse-lit lab, someone holds a small, unremarkable vial up to the light. Inside is a pale substance, powder, crystals, maybe something in between. Nothing about it announces importance, no glow, no dramatic color, just matter that looks like countless other samples catalogued in countless drawers. And yet, when this substance is mixed the right way, something astonishing can happen. A wound begins to close. Not metaphorically, literally. For most of our lives, we learn to accept injury as a one-way road. A cut heals, yes, but not by returning the world to what it was. It heals by leaving a scar. A broken bone mends, but it's never quite the same. A damaged organ may recover, but often with limits. We carry evidence of what has happened to us, written in tissue. Now zoom out to the things we build. Everything scars. Roads crack, pipes corrode, buildings settle, machines wear down. We call it maintenance when we keep up, and failure when we don't. Entire economies are shaped by the assumption that materials degrade and that we will forever be patching the same weaknesses. But what if some of our materials could do what skin does? What if, when damaged, they could restore themselves, re-knitting at the molecular level instead of relying on external repair? This isn't the same story as self-healing concrete, where cracks fill with mineral growth. This is something more intimate. Polymers and coatings engineered to rebond after being cut or scratched. Plastic-like materials that behave less like dead matter and more like living tissue, responsive, restorative, strangely patient. Scientists have developed polymers that can heal through heat, light, pressure, or chemical triggers. Some incorporate reversible bonds that break under stress and then reform when conditions allow. Some use microcapsules filled with healing agents that spill into a scratch and harden. Some are designed to heal repeatedly, not just once, like a body that keeps learning how to mend. In the lab, the demonstrations can feel unreal. A piece of material is cut. The edges are pressed together. Time passes. The cut fades. Tensile strength returns. Sometimes, the material becomes nearly indistinguishable from its original form. A damage that would have been permanent becomes temporary. The implications scatter outward into everything. Phone screens that resist scratches or repair them. Car coatings that erase minor abrasions. Aircraft components with improved longevity. Protective gear that doesn't degrade as quickly. medical devices that maintain integrity longer, infrastructure that doesn't demand constant replacement. And if you follow that thread far enough, you find a dream that is almost philosophical, a world where objects don't age as brutally. So why aren't self-healing polymers and coatings part of everyday life? Because the world doesn't run on possible, it runs on reliable. A material that heals in a lab must heal in the sun, in the cold, in humidity, under ultraviolet exposure, in contact with oils, sweat, chemicals, and abrasion. It must do so without releasing harmful compounds, without weakening unexpectedly, without changing performance in subtle ways that only show up after years. And it must be manufacturable at scale. It must be cheap enough. It must fit into existing production lines. It must satisfy regulators. It must be insurable. It must survive the brutal test that most technologies fail, being used by people who aren't careful. There's also an economic gravity that pulls against durability. Many industries are built around predictable turnover. Products are designed with replacement cycles in mind, whether explicitly or through the quiet compromises of cost-cutting. A phone that lasts 10 years disrupts an entire ecosystem of upgrades. A coating that never needs reapplication disrupts service markets. A component that refuses to wear out alters the rhythm of consumption. Again, this doesn't require a villain. It requires only the fact that modern economies often reward movement, new sales, new models, new cycles, more than they reward stability. And yet, the hunger for repair is everywhere. You can see it in the popularity of restoration videos, the satisfaction people feel watching something damaged become whole. You can see it in the rise of right-to-repair movements, in the anger people feel when devices are designed to be disposable. You can see it in how we talk about sustainability, not as an abstract virtue, but as a practical desire to stop drowning in our own broken things. Self-healing materials fit that desire perfectly. They offer a kind of quiet mercy. Fewer landfills, fewer supply chains strained, fewer resources extracted just to replace what could have endured. But mercy is not the same as inevitability. To make healing materials common, we must decide that healing is a design priority, not a luxury feature. We must choose to invest in longevity even when novelty is more profitable. In the lab, the vial goes back on the shelf. The sample is catalogued. The data is recorded. Somewhere in the world, a device gets scratched, a component degrades, a pipe coating fails, a phone case cracks. Replacement is ordered. Waste is generated. The cycle continues. And the question hovers, not accusingly, but gently, like a hand resting on a shoulder. If we can teach matter to mend itself, what is stopping us from building a culture that values mending? And if we don't, what does it say about us that we chose a world of constant replacement, even when repair was within reach? At night, in a lab where the windows reflect only darkness, a researcher watches a screen trace a curve. The line rises, dips, stabilizes, data behaving the way it should when something is real. There is a particular calm that comes with a repeatable result. It doesn't feel like excitement at first. It feels like relief, like a door that finally opens after you've spent years pushing on walls. This is the last chapter before the conclusion, and it returns us to the theme we've been circling from the start. Not every breakthrough disappears because it failed. Sometimes it disappears because it succeeded in the wrong era or in the wrong language or without the right scaffolding of trust and infrastructure to hold it up. One of the most haunting examples is not a single invention, but a pattern in science itself. The way promising results can be orphaned when they don't fit what the world currently knows how to build. Think of the ideas we've visited. Viruses that can be matched like keys to resistant bacteria. Materials grown from fields that can rival metal. Crops engineered or bred to carry hidden nourishment. Concrete that seals its own cracks. Rock dust that restores soil while drawing carbon downward. Ocean temperature gradients turned into steady power. Immune responses coaxed into remembering tumors as threats. Membranes thin enough to make clean water less expensive. Reactor designs that treat safety as a passive default. Transit tubes that imagine motion without congestion. Polymers that behave like skin and heal scratches and cuts. Each one has its own technical story, and each one has its own friction with reality. But together, they form a single question with many faces. What do we do when a solution challenges the system that profits from the problem? Sometimes the challenge is economic. Longer-lasting materials reduce replacement. Sometimes it's institutional. Regulators have no category for a new class of therapy. Sometimes it's cultural. Communities don't trust a seed that arrived with a foreign narrative. Sometimes it's logistical. Scaling from lab to world requires a supply chain that doesn't yet exist. Sometimes it's psychological. We prefer what we understand, even if what we understand hurts us. If you listen carefully, you can hear the same tension across all of them. Discovery is not just about finding new truths. It is about persuading society to reorganize around those truths. And reorganization is painful. What's remarkable is how often the problem is not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of coordination. A breakthrough may require new diagnostics, new manufacturing, new training, new business models, new public engagement. It may require years of patient iteration. It may require governments willing to invest beyond a single election cycle. It may require corporations willing to sacrifice short-term profit for long-term stability. It may require communities willing to trust institutions that have, in many places, earned distrust. In other words, it may require adulthood. We tend to imagine progress as inevitable because the universe is rational. But progress is not guaranteed by rationality. It is negotiated by humans, and humans are complicated. We are driven by fear and hope, by habit and ambition, by the desire to protect our families and the desire to protect our reputations. We are capable of generosity and capable of denial. We are capable of seeing the future and then choosing the present anyway. So what becomes of the orphaned breakthroughs? Some wait quietly until the world catches up. Phage therapy, for example, has seen renewed interest as antibiotic resistance grows. Immunotherapy has exploded, echoing older insights with modern rigor. Self-healing materials and advanced membranes continue to mature as manufacturing improves. The ideas don't always die. They hibernate. Others become specialized tools used in narrow cases, in niche markets, in places where their value is undeniable and the barriers are lower. A technology can survive in the margins for decades, like a rare plant in a protected valley, until the climate shifts and it can spread. And some, yes, fade, not because they were false, but because the chain of support snapped. The graduate student moved on. The grant ended. The company pivoted. The prototype aged. The lab's priorities shifted. In that sense, science can be heartbreakingly mortal. Knowledge doesn't always preserve itself just because it's true. In the lab at night, the researcher saves the data and shuts down the equipment. The screen goes dark. The building is quiet again. Outside, the world continues with its familiar problems. Infections that resist drugs, infrastructure that cracks, soil that depletes, water that needs treatment, energy systems that strain, cities that choke with traffic, bodies that battle disease. The solutions we've explored are not fantasies. They are not guarantees either. They are possibilities, some closer than others, all demanding more than admiration, because admiration is passive, adoption is active. And that brings us to the last reflection before we close this journey. Maybe the real measure of a civilization is not the brilliance of its discoveries, but its willingness to make room for them, to change laws, budgets, habits, industries, and expectations, to accept that better solutions may require us to stop doing profitable things, to admit that progress is not a line we walk, it is a home we remodel while living inside it. So the question we carry into the epilogue is simple, and it is heavy. When the next breakthrough arrives, quiet, effective, disruptive, will we recognize it as a gift, or will we mistake it for a threat and file it away until it becomes history? So here we are, at the end of a journey that began in an archive room. Papers, prototypes, test results, and the strange silence that sometimes follows success. If there is one thread that runs through every chapter, it's this: discovery is only half the story. The other half is what we choose to do with it. We like the mythology of the breakthrough, the lone inventor, the sudden insight, the moment the data finally lines up like stars. Those moments are real, and they deserve reverence. But history is crowded with moments that were real and still didn't change the world, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. A virus that hunts bacteria with elegant specificity, a car material grown from fields instead of forged from ore, a crop that carries iron or vitamin A like hidden light inside grain, concrete that seals its own fractures, rock dust that restores soil while pulling carbon downward, ocean heat differences turned into steady power, immune responses awakened to see a tumor as a threat, filters so thin they make clean water feel like an engineering problem, not a moral crisis, nuclear designs that try to make safety the default state, transit systems that imagine motion without congestion, polymers and coatings that mend their own wounds. None of these ideas asks only for technology. They ask for a different posture toward the future. They ask for patience where we crave speed. They ask for long-term thinking where incentives reward short-term wins. They ask us to redesign systems, not just insert gadgets. They ask us to admit something difficult. Some problems persist, not because we lack solutions, but because we have organized our lives around the problem's existence. This is the part that's hard to say out loud. A world that profits from treatment may be slow to embrace prevention. A world that profits from replacement may be slow to embrace durability. A world that profits from centralized control may be slow to embrace decentralized resilience. A world that has built careers and identities around certain tools may be slow to accept new ones, even when they work. Yet none of this is hopeless. It is simply human. And because it is human, it can be changed by human choices. What changes a system is rarely a single miracle. It is usually pressure applied from many directions at once. Scientists refining evidence, engineers proving reliability, communities demanding accountability, policymakers updating rules, investors accepting long horizons, educators teaching new frameworks, and ordinary people insisting that the way we've always done it is not a moral argument. Progress, in this light, becomes a collective act of courage. And courage doesn't always look like boldness. Sometimes it looks like sustained attention. It looks like funding the unglamorous pilot project. It looks like building standards for a new category of medicine. It looks like rewriting procurement rules to value lifetime benefits instead of lowest upfront cost. It looks like treating trust as a real resource that must be earned, not assumed. It looks like listening to skepticism without surrendering to fear. Because skepticism, when honest, is not the enemy of progress. It is the safeguard that keeps progress from becoming dogma. The problem is not doubt. The problem is when doubt becomes a permanent excuse to do nothing, while the familiar harms continue. If there is an ethical spine to this story, it is that we should be careful in how we talk about what might be possible. Speculation should remain speculation. Promise should remain promise until it becomes proof. But we should also be careful not to let the demand for certainty become a way of avoiding responsibility. The world is not asking us for perfect solutions. It is asking us for better ones. In the end, the most haunting image is not a lab vial or a prototype panel or a sealed ocean pipe. It is a person standing in the consequences of delay, a patient waiting for an antibiotic that still works, a child whose body is tired from iron deficiency, a community boiling water over scarce fuel, a bridge quietly cracking under traffic, a farmer watching soil thin away, a coastline watching the sea rise, a commuter watching brake lights bloom every morning, a family hoping the next treatment will be the one that changes everything. These people are not metaphors. They are the reason the gap between it works and it's used matters. So perhaps the most humanistic way to end is not with certainty, but with a question worth carrying forward. What if the future is not something we discover, but something we permit? Not by believing every claim, not by chasing every shiny invention, but by building the kind of society that can recognize real solutions and make room for them, carefully, ethically, and bravely. And if memory is one of our oldest teachers, then maybe the lesson is this: the truth doesn't always disappear because it was wrong. Sometimes it disappears because we weren't ready to live differently. The next time a quiet breakthrough arrives, effective, disruptive, inconvenient, may we have the wisdom to ask, not only does it work, but also, what must we change so it can?